One person cannot change an entire league, but one person carrying the truth can expose the price that an entire era tried to hide. At an age when his body already bears the full marks of years exploited to exhaustion, José Canseco has witnessed more loss than an ordinary person could endure, while still holding faith in tomorrow. Happiness ended a long time ago. He lost friends while they were still breathing, lost family in irreparable separations, lost honor in the public eye, lost the protection of a system that once built him up as an icon, only to turn its back without mercy. He watched his career burn to ashes right when it was still profitable for others. And now in these years when every physical pain reminds him that time is no longer on his side, Canseco says something that startles many: he wants it all to end. Not as a cry for help, but as a stark admission that he is too tired to keep existing in the role of someone perpetually judged. When asked about death, Canseco does not dodge or soften the answer. He says it straight, in a cold tone honed through years of endurance. For him, death is no longer the most frightening thing. More frightening is having to keep living in a world where all his losses are seen as deserved punishment. The lowest points in his life did not come in a single moment, but stretched across many years, as layer after layer of meaning was peeled away. Career gone, family fractured, body in constant pain, and his voice stifled by prejudice. Compared to those things, death becomes simply brutally straightforward. But what led a man who once had everything to this harsh acceptance? What makes someone once celebrated by all of America for his power now see the end as a form of release? We are not as different from him as we think. Whatever can bring one person down could very likely bring down millions of others if they were placed in the same machine and forced to pay the same price. The answer does not lie in a shocking statement, but deep within a life of unimaginable pain, magnified failures, and losses heavy enough to break anyone not allowed to be weak. This is not a beautified version of José Canseco's story. This is the raw truth about what happens when life takes away not just fame and money, but also the right to make mistakes and the right to let go. It is the story of a man who learned that sometimes the greatest courage is not continuing to fight to live in pain, but daring to face the thought of death as the final stopping point of endurance. And the journey that led him to this dark moment began a very long time ago, long before the name José Canseco became an icon, before it became controversial, and before history framed it as a warning rather than a human being. If you want to understand why a man who once stood at the pinnacle reached this dark moment, please subscribe to the channel and keep following José Canseco's story in the next part. José Canseco's family dream did not begin with ambition to become a sports legend, but with a very human fear of poverty, fear of being left behind, fear of a life with no way out. When they left Cuba for America, it was not a journey in search of glory, but a quiet escape from memories of deprivation and insecurity, where every meal, every roof could vanish overnight. For Canseco's parents, America was not the romantic promised land from posters, but a new battlefield where only those strong enough, tough enough, ruthless enough were allowed to survive. In that context, success was never seen as a choice. It was an obligation, a debt that children had to repay for their parents' sacrifices, the only justification for leaving their homeland. Canseco's childhood therefore had no room for slowness or hesitation. Every passing day carried an unspoken message: you have to rise by any means necessary. No one asked that boy if he was tired, if he was scared, if he wanted to stop. Those questions were considered luxuries, even dangerous, because in an immigrant family, weakness is not an emotional state, it is a sign of failure. Canseco grew up in that compressed atmosphere, where love was tied to expectations, and recognition came only when he proved his worth with concrete results. Not effort, but victory, not trying, but excelling. Anything else was not enough. He learned very early that if he was not stronger than others, he would be pushed to the sidelines, just like what his family had experienced before leaving Cuba. The fear of poverty was not just his parents' memory, it became a spiritual inheritance passed directly to the children, seeping into every decision, every sleep, every seemingly harmless moment of childhood. In that world, failure was not allowed to exist, because it was not just a personal mistake, it was a threat to the entire family. Canseco was not taught how to face defeat, only how to avoid it by any means necessary. And when a child grows up believing that losing means being abandoned, he will do everything to never show weakness in front of others. Training sessions were not simply physical conditioning, they were rituals to prove self-worth. Every pain, every fatigue, every urge to stop was swallowed inside, because Canseco understood that if weakness was exposed, he would become a burden. In that family, no one said this cruelly, but it was present in every look, every silence, every praise reserved only for the winner. Canseco had no privilege to fail like other children, he had no space to try and lure, he had to be right, he had to be strong, he had to be better. And from there a dangerous seed began to form, the idea that human value lies not in who one is, but in how one surpasses others. When Canseco stepped into the wider world, carrying an increasingly powerful body and an unquenchable desire to prove himself, he did not realize he had been programmed from very early on, programmed to never accept failure, programmed to see weakness as the enemy, programmed to believe that if he stopped, if he slowed down, if he was no longer superior, the world would abandon him, just as life had once threatened his family years ago. The immigrant dream, born from the hope of survival, unintentionally became the mold that shaped Canseco's entire life. It gave him extraordinary drive, but it also took away the right to be weak. And in a world where failure is not allowed to exist, the price paid for always winning is often never seen, until everything has gone too far to turn back. If the immigrant dream taught José Canseco that failure was not allowed to exist, then growing up with his twin brother José Canseco turned that lesson into a constant, nameless, unspoken obsession that rooted so deeply it could not be uprooted. Ozzy was not just a blood brother, not just someone sharing a home, meals, and childhood memories. He gradually became the invisible yardstick for every bit of José's worth. The two boys looked so alike that outsiders could hardly tell them apart, but that very similarity made the world around them constantly put them on a scale. Who was stronger? Who was taller? Who ran faster? Who hit the ball farther? Those questions were not asked cruelly, but they repeated long enough to become a haunting whisper in a child's mind. Every praise given to one, whether accidental or intentional, rang like a reminder that the other was not enough. In a family where success was an obligation, comparison did not need to be overt to hurt, it just needed to exist. José grew up with the feeling that he always had to stay one step ahead, not out of hatred for his brother, but out of fear of being replaced. If there are two who are so alike, the world only needs one, and if there is only room for one, the slower one will be pushed aside. That fear did not come from healthy competition, but from a survival instinct formed too early. José did not dare be weak, did not dare slow down, did not dare be less, because deep down he believed that just one moment of falling behind would mean his place was gone. Ozzy, even unintentionally, became the mirror reflecting all that anxiety. Every time José looked at his brother, he did not just see a sibling, he saw the biggest question of his life. If I am not better than him, what am I? That comparison needed no words, no orders. It existed in the adult's eyes, in the side conversations, in the way the world paid more attention to the one who was just slightly superior. Gradually, José's identity was not built from curiosity or the joy of self-discovery, but from the fear of losing position. He did not run because he loved running, did not lift weights because he loved strength. He did it because each time he did better, he felt a little safer. Safer from being abandoned, safer from becoming superfluous. In the mind of a twin boy, existence is not a given. It is something to be fought for every day. That is why the concept of freedom never truly appeared in José's childhood. Every choice carried the shadow of fear. Every effort was driven by the haunting question, have I excelled enough yet? When people later talk about Canseco's strength, they only see muscles, achievements, and numbers. Few see the root of that strength being nourished by prolonged insecurity, by the feeling that if he did not constantly prove his worth, he would vanish into silence. Twinship, which should have been a source of comfort, instead became a nameless pressure, making every step José took carry the fear of being replaced. And when a person forms their identity from that fear, they will be willing to trade away many things to hold on to the position they believe is unique to them. Not out of blind ambition, but because from very early on, Jose learned a brutal lesson in a world with no room for the weak. Slowing down even one beat is enough to be left behind. The door to Major League Baseball opened for José Canseco, like a gateway to heaven for someone who grew up in fear of being left behind. From the very first moment he stepped into that world, Canseco understood that this was the place where all his childhood obsessions were transformed into tangible value. Strength was celebrated, superiority was rewarded, and the winner didn't need permission to exist. MLB didn't ask where he came from, how much trauma or fear he carried. The league only saw the swings, the balls soaring over the fences, the numbers big enough to sell tickets, jerseys, and feed a massive hunger for entertainment. For Canseco, it was the final confirmation that everything he had endured before wasn't meaningless. But the price of that confirmation came much faster than a young man who hadn't yet matured could understand or protect himself from. The peak arrived too soon, and when the peak comes before maturity, it doesn't lift a person up, it swallows them from the inside. Canseco's body quickly stopped being seen as a living body and became a money-making machine. Every practice, every game, every time on the field was calculated by performance and profit. Home runs weren't just personal achievements, they were products, proof of a sports model where power was exploited to its absolute limit. In that atmosphere, no one stopped to ask Canseco how he felt as his body grew heavier, as the pains began to appear, as the pace of life was pushed to a level that an ordinary person could hardly sustain long-term. The first signs of destruction were completely overshadowed by the glow of accomplishments. When you hit the ball far enough, no one cares how much you pay for it. When you bring in revenue and fame, questions about health, psychology, and human limits become unnecessary luxuries. Canseco lived in a world where his value was measured by how far the ball flew, not by the pain after every game or the growing emptiness inside. And he, with everything he had learned from childhood and from being a twin, didn't resist at all. On the contrary, he threw himself into that machine with terrifying intensity, because deep down the old fear still lingered: if I slow down, if I weaken, I'll be replaced. MLB didn't force him to become a machine, but it created an environment where refusing that role meant removing yourself from the game. Canseco understood that rule very clearly. He understood that here, there was no room for fragility, no space to listen to his body or question limits. With each passing day, he tied himself tighter to the image of absolute strength that the league and the public demanded. But that very image began to turn against him. The pains didn't disappear, they were only postponed. The warning signs weren't healed, they were ignored. And while the whole country was intoxicated by performances that pushed beyond limits, Canseco gradually lost connection with his own body. He no longer listened to it, because listening meant admitting he wasn't invincible. Admitting that, for him, was no different from returning to the starting point of the fear of being abandoned. So he kept pushing forward, kept forcing his body past limits it silently protested. The achievements kept coming, the fame kept swelling, and the machine kept running smoothly. No one in that system had any incentive to stop. No one benefited from Canseco slowing down or questioning what he was trading away. And it was in that collective silence that a long-term tragedy began to be written, line by line, with his own body. The peak arriving too fast didn't give Canseco a chance to understand who he was beyond the role of a power icon. When everything was decided by numbers and distances, the human being behind them gradually faded away. Canseco wasn't forced to sell his body, but he was richly rewarded every time he did, and punished with oblivion if he dared to stop. In a world like that, the seemingly free choice really only had one direction, and Canseco, with everything programmed into him from childhood, stepped straight into that peak without time to realize that his own body was being sold before he had even matured, before he could understand that there are prices never shown on the scoreboard, but collected in full in the years to come, when the lights go out, and no one asks anymore how far he can hit. The Oakland A's exploded like a fever. The whole country wasn't ready to question. Stands packed, television chasing them, the press calling them by a nickname both affectionate and mythic, Bash Brothers. At the center of that frenzy, José Canseco became the perfect image of what the league wanted to sell to the world: pure power, unyielding masculinity, hits far enough to make any limit seem meaningless. The Oakland A's weren't just a team. They were an entertainment machine running on cheers and record numbers, and Canseco was the biggest, brightest gear in that machine. He was worshipped as a phenomenon, an icon of a new era where baseball was no longer about tactical finesse, but a display of raw power. But right in that moment of being hailed, Canseco began to be locked into an image he could no longer escape. He was no longer seen as a developing human being, but as a finished product, a machine designed to repeat the same miracle over and over. Every home run brought applause, money and fame, but at the same time tightened the invisible rope binding him to that role. No one wanted to see Canseco change. No one wanted to see him slow down, rethink or question. The world just wanted more hits farther, harder, more ferocious. And every time he met those expectations, he sank deeper into the golden cage built by his own success. Bash Brothers became a brand, and Canseco was no longer José. He was half of an icon that always had to maintain maximum strength. In that intoxicated atmosphere, success was no longer a reward for effort, it became an obligation to fulfill. If today he didn't hit as far as yesterday, questions would appear immediately. If the pace slowed even a little, doubt would arise. And Canseco understood that very clearly. He understood that in this world, holding on to a position is even harder than winning it. Success, which should have brought freedom, became the most sophisticated trap. It forced him to repeat himself, to keep surpassing limits that had already been pushed too far, because if not, everything he had built would collapse right before his eyes. Every home run therefore wasn't just a moment of glory, it was a step deeper into dependency. Canseco no longer played to prove himself, he played to maintain an image millions had grown accustomed to. He wasn't allowed to be tired, wasn't allowed to weaken, wasn't allowed to become normal. Under the bright lights of Oakland, abnormality was what was demanded, and the price for meeting that demand grew higher every day. Physical pains were considered minor, warning signs were ignored, because in the fever called Bash Brothers, no one wanted to hear about human limits, they just wanted more explosive moments. Canseco became a prisoner of the very fame he created, locked in a role he couldn't refuse if he still wanted to exist in the game, and ironically, that very success made stopping impossible, because when an entire system had grown accustomed to exploiting his power, his choice to withdraw would be seen as betrayal. In that world, there was no room for fatigue or self-questioning, only room for results. The Bash Brothers kept being praised, Oakland kept selling out, and Canseco kept moving forward, carrying the feeling that every step ahead was also a step farther from himself. Success, once seen as an escape from the fear of being left behind, now turned into a sealed prison where Canseco was both the brightest star and the longest held captive. And in that prison there were no visible bars, only expectations that could never be lowered, applause that didn't allow silence, and a bitter truth that Canseco began to feel more clearly after every hit: when fame reaches its peak, it doesn't free a person, it swallows them, bit by bit, until even the desire to be an ordinary human becomes an unattainable luxury. There was never a single moment in José Canseco's life that he could point to and say, everything started here. Steroids didn't appear as an impulsive decision, not as a slip in a moment of weakness one night, but as the inevitable result of an entire ecosystem built to crush anyone who dared to slow down. In that era, MLB was no longer a playground for pure talent, it was a massive machine running on power, speed and increasingly inhuman numbers. The stands demanded more, television needed longer home runs, owners needed higher revenue, and the players, living bodies, were pushed into the position of having to meet all of it, without being allowed to ask questions. No one sat Canseco down to ask what his body was enduring, whether the nagging pains in his joints, or the prolonged fatigue were wearing him down. The only thing the system cared about was, could he still hit as far as yesterday? In that world, steroids weren't introduced as cheating, they were a tool, an unofficial but tacitly acknowledged part of surviving. As those around him got bigger, stronger, recovered faster, the brutal truth became clear: if you couldn't keep up, you'd be replaced, forgotten, pushed to the edge like an obsolete product. Canseco understood this very clearly, because his entire life had taught him that failure was not allowed to exist. Stopping meant personally signing his own sentence to disappear from the lights, and so he accepted that silent agreement, not with joy, but with fear. Steroids didn't give him a sense of victory, they just gave him more time, time to stay on the field, to keep being called by name, to keep proving he hadn't been discarded. But every injection, every cycle, was part of the unspoken price. His body began to change in ways the lights didn't reach. Pains grew more intense, mood became unstable, long sleepless nights stretched out, a feeling of being trapped inside his own skin. The cruelest part was the collective silence. Everyone knew but no one spoke. Everyone benefited, but no one took responsibility. Canseco wasn't the only one, but he was one of the very few awake enough to realize that once you stepped onto this path, there was no safe way back. You couldn't just stop, because then your body would betray you, and the system would too. Each passing season, the achievements were still celebrated, while the destruction stayed hidden beneath contracts and cheers. Canseco lived in that paradox, praised for superhuman strength while inside he knew he was gradually trading away his youth, his health, and his peace, to feed an image he no longer controlled. Steroids became an invisible chain. They helped him survive in the short term, but locked him into a system that allowed no weakness or confession. And the longer he stayed in that silent agreement, the more Canseco realized the most painful truth. This was no longer just his personal story. It was the story of an entire sport that had accepted sacrificing people to preserve the entertainment. When he looked around the locker room and saw bodies growing bigger, but eyes growing emptier, Canseco understood that he wasn't paying this price alone. But unlike most, he wasn't able to lie to himself that everything would be fine. He knew, very clearly, that every next hit only prolonged a spiral whose end was already set. Once you stepped in, there was no turning back, not because of a lack of courage, but because the entire system was designed so no one could escape without being crushed. And in that silence, Canseco kept playing, kept smiling for the cameras, while inside him a part of the human being was slowly vanishing, leaving behind a body operating like a machine, and a soul growing ever more exhausted from carrying a collective lie he had never been the only one to create. There came a point when José Canseco began to realize that the most terrifying thing wasn't the injuries. It was the feeling of being a stranger to his own body. It didn't happen in a dramatic moment. There was no sound of breaking bones echoing across the field for everyone to witness. The breaking point came quietly, prolonged, like a fine rain falling endlessly until the ground could no longer absorb it. His body betrayed him little by little. Pains appeared without warning. Strength arrived slower and left faster. Recovery that once took just one night now became days of struggle. Canseco no longer trusted the signals from his body, because for years he had been taught to ignore them. When his body spoke, he treated it as noise to be silenced. When it begged for help, he treated it as a sign of weakness to be hidden. And then the body responded by shutting down. The sense of control vanished, replaced by constant unease. He woke up with a fatigue he had never known, stepped into the gym with the fear that today he might not still be yesterday's self. At the same time, his mind began shifting in dangerous directions. Anger no longer needed a reason. Irritability became the default state. Long silences in his head filled with a simmering inner violence where every thought collided without escape. Canseco noticed himself reacting more intensely, speaking sharper words, pushing others away without understanding why. He was no longer just fighting on the field, he had to fight himself in every waking moment. What had once been praised as mental toughness now revealed its dark side: emotional numbness, the ability to self-destruct for goals, the habit of treating himself like a tool. And right then, a painful realization began to form. He understood that the price he was paying wasn't just his health, it was the real human being inside. He had traded away sensitivity, the ability to listen, and the right to stop in order to hold on to an image the world demanded. On long nights, when the stadium lights went out and the cheers faded, Canseco faced the raw truth. He no longer knew who this body belonged to. It reacted out of habit, operated on demand, but it was no longer a safe refuge for his mind. He remembered the early days when strength brought a sense of freedom, when every step forward proved he wouldn't be left behind. Now that strength had become a heavy armor he couldn't remove, every attempt to slow down triggered a fierce reaction from his body. Every thought of stopping brought fear rising like a survival instinct. If I stop, who will I be? And that very question kept him going, even though he already understood the road ahead was no longer forward progress. It was a long slide. Canseco began to see the signs he had once refused to face head-on: prolonged pains, emotional changes, impulsive decisions to fill the voids. He no longer found joy in victory, only brief relief at making it through one more day. His body was no longer an ally, it was a battlefield. And in that battle, there were no cheering crowds, no scoreboard to measure, only silent erosion. He understood he was paying with his very humanity, with parts that could never be recovered. But that understanding came too late. The system didn't allow turning back, and his body didn't allow easy stopping. Canseco was trapped between two fears, the fear of continuing and the fear of disappearing. Both were painful, but he had gone too far to choose the less painful path. In rare moments of clarity, he realized the greatest tragedy wasn't being betrayed by the system. It was learning to betray himself to survive in it. The breaking point wasn't a fall on the field, it was the internal fracture where he understood that what he had lost could never be regained by any contract or round of applause. And though it was too late to stop, that awareness still haunted him like a silent confession. The price of always being strong is a day when you no longer know where you're weak enough to heal. The fall of José Canseco did not begin with an official verdict. There was no solemn sentencing moment or resounding accusation in a courtroom. It began with a cold silence, then followed by headlines that shifted tone so quickly no one had time to notice when adoration turned into contempt. The media, which had once elevated him as a national icon of power and a new era, turned without warning. Praising articles were replaced by sharp, insinuating lines. The same person, the same body, but now narrated in a different language: suspicion, sarcasm, condemnation. No trial needed, no debate required. The story was rewritten without asking the main character's opinion. Fans turned their backs just as fast. The stands that once cheered his name now went silent or booed. The jerseys once worn with pride became uncomfortable reminders. The change was so ruthless that Canseco barely had time to grasp what was happening. One day he was still the symbol of the hunger to win. The next he became something everyone wanted to forget to protect their faith in the sport they loved. In that reversal, Canseco lost the most important thing, the right to tell his own story. His words were chopped up. His attempts to explain were dismissed as excuses. His silence was interpreted as proof of guilt. And when he spoke, his voice was drowned out by a chorus that had already decided the conclusion. His reputation collapsed without a verdict, because society had grown accustomed to judging faster than understanding. No one wanted to hear about the system that created those conditions. No one wanted to face the uncomfortable question of whether he was truly alone or just the first one exposed. It was far easier to turn one person into a stain so the rest could keep their illusion of purity. Canseco was pushed from the center to the margins, becoming an outsider in the very story where he had once been the protagonist. All his past achievements were re-examined through suspicious eyes, as if they had never existed unless accompanied by the moral perfection the public demanded. The most painful thing was not losing fame, it was the complete denial of the entire journey that had come before, as if all those years of effort, pain and sacrifice were reduced to a single black mark at the end of the line. Canseco came to understand a bitter truth: the public's love always comes with conditions. When you fulfill their dream, you're celebrated. When you force them to confront an uncomfortable truth, you become the traitor. No gray areas, no empathy, only two states: idle or stain. And once pushed into the second, every door slams shut at once. He was no longer asked for his opinion, he became the object people talked about. No longer a human being, but an example of downfall, of the price of ambition, of the moral lesson society wanted to retell to itself. In that process, Canseco was stripped of the right to complicate the story. the right to say things were not as simple as the short headlines. His reputation disintegrated not because of one single act, but because an entire system needed a scapegoat to wash its hands clean, and Canseco, who had once been built as the perfect icon of strength, became the most convenient choice. When the lights finally went out, he stood amid the ruins of the image that had, realizing that collapse doesn't need an official verdict, just the silent consensus of the crowd. From national icon to stain, that journey didn't take long. It only required one moment, when society decided they no longer needed him in the story they wanted to believe. After his reputation collapsed, what remained around José Canseco was not a quiet space for healing, but a cold void where family had once existed. This tragedy did not arrive through accident or funeral. No one left because of death. They left because they could no longer bear it. His marriage fractured in prolonged silence, where violence did not need fists to inflict harm. It was emotional violence, unprovoked anger, words sharp as knives, prolonged instability, that turned the home into a battlefield of unnamed tensions. When a person has grown accustomed to living in a constant state of defense, every small collision can explode. Canseco did not intend to destroy his family. He simply brought home what the system had forged in him: suspicion, pent-up rage, and the fear of being abandoned. But for those closest to him, that was a burden they could not carry forever. The role of husband and father was therefore broken in pieces. He was physically present, but his mind was shattered amid the obsessions, the pains, and the unspoken shame. Being a father requires patience, stability, and the ability to be present, qualities he had traded away for years to maintain the image on the field. Every time he tried to make up for it, another storm rose in his head, sweeping away every effort. Children need safety, yet he himself no longer felt safe in his own body and mind. So the distance grew, not through loud arguments, but through accumulated exhaustion, the kind of exhaustion that makes people stop waiting. The family gradually became unwilling witnesses to the collapse of one man. They saw the sleepless nights, the unfinished promises, the brief moments of clarity that then vanished. No one wanted to be the judge, but everyone was forced to protect themselves. And on a day not marked by any specific tragedy, they chose to leave, not out of hatred, but out of survival. No one left because of death. They left because they could no longer endure living in that vortex any longer. Canseco remained in the empty house, a space too large for a man accustomed to being surrounded by noise. The walls that once echoed laughter now only bounced back his own footsteps. The silence here was different from the silence of lost fame. It had no audience, no commentary. It was a silence that forced a person to confront the personal consequences of choices stretched across many years. He began to understand that some losses cannot be measured by money or titles. There are voids that cannot be filled by belated apologies. In that house, memories became the heaviest thing. Every object was a reminder of moments that had slipped away while he was too busy fighting the world to realize he was losing the people closest to him. Loneliness did not arrive as punishment, but as the natural consequence of a life stretched to the breaking point. Canseco did not see himself as the sole victim. He recognized that those who left had endured enough, but that acknowledgement did not make the pain lighter. It only made the nights longer. The family's disintegration closed another chapter of the collapse, one without media, without crowds. Just one man facing the truth that the system could take away his fame in an instant. But he himself had allowed the silent wounds to burrow deep into his private life until nothing was left to hold on to. Left in the empty house, Canseco learned a belated lesson: there are losses that do not happen on the field, and when you realize you've lost, the stands have long since departed. When the house was empty and fame no longer offered shelter, José Canseco reached a decision that many found impossible to understand. He chose to speak it all out. Not in a staged press conference, not with half-hearted apologies, but by laying bare everything he had seen, done, and had to accept in order to survive. The book Juiced was born not as an act of revenge, but as the final action of a man who believed that truth, even if it came late, still held liberating value. Canseco believed that if everything was brought into the light, If the system was forced to look at itself squarely, then at least the pain he carried would not be meaningless. He believed speaking the truth could bring a form of atonement, not just for himself but for the sport that had consumed too many young bodies. But Canseco misjudged one core thing: the system never forgives the one who breaks the silent agreement. His teammates, those who once shared the locker room and the lights, chose silence, not because they were innocent, but because silence was the only way to keep surviving. Truth, in that context, was not a moral value, it was a threat. And when the threat appeared, the system fought back with everything it had. The details Canseco provided were questioned, dissected, assigned personal motives. People did not ask whether what he said was true, they asked why he dared to say it. The story was flipped from whistleblower, he was framed as traitor. No one wanted to hear that steroids were not a lone personal choice, but the condition of survival for an entire era. It was far easier to turn Canseco into a bitter liar, an attention seeker, someone who couldn't accept his fate. Truth then became a burden society did not want to carry. Canseco realized that speaking the truth does not liberate, it exiles. He was shut out of official conversations, out of invitations, out of the history told in comfortable ways. Doors that had already closed were now bolted shut. Former teammates avoided him. The league kept its distance. The media, which had already turned away, now had extra reason to nail his image as a destroyer. In that moment, Canseco understood the cruelest lesson of his life: truth is only welcomed when it does not threaten power. When truth shakes the foundations of an industry, the one who speaks it pays the price for everyone. He was not seen as a brave man warning about a toxic system, but as a breaker of the unwritten rules, and the price for breaking those rules was total isolation. Canseco stood in the desert of public opinion, with no allies, no place to return. He began to understand that Juiced was not just a book, it was the official marker confirming his exiled status. There was no path to reconciliation, no chance to be heard neutrally. Everything he said afterward was doubted before it was even read. But even so, Canseco did not retract his words. He knew that if he returned to silence, he would betray the rare moment when he had chosen honesty. In that solitude, he recognized the bitter paradox. His entire career had been destroyed by a collective lie, but it was only when he spoke the truth that he was truly punished. Juice did not free Canseco from his past, but it served as his final confession that he no longer wanted to live in pretense, and that very refusal to pretend was what pushed him beyond the boundaries of what American sports society would accept, not as a warning worth listening to, but as a traitor who needed to be forgotten. After Juiced, the road ahead for José Canseco held no turns leading back to the light. It was a long, flat stretch where time passed without bringing redemption or healing. His post-career was not marked by Hall of Fame ceremonies, nor by honorary advisory roles or open doors in the industry. Instead, it was bankruptcy after bankruptcy, prolonged lawsuits that drained him financially and spiritually, and physical pains that became the rhythm of everyday life. The body that had once been exploited to its limits now had to bear the consequences in silence. No more contracts, no more premium insurance, no more medical teams ready to step in. When the lights went out, Canseco realized a raw truth: the system that had once used every fiber of his muscle had no obligation to care for the rest of his life. The old injuries don't disappear, they accumulate. Back, shoulders, knees, each part tells a chapter of the past through persistent pain. There are mornings he wakes up feeling like his body has aged a few more years overnight, but physical pain has never been the most unbearable thing. What's more erosive is the absence of any safety net, no post-care program, no humane transition from the peak to everyday life. His years of survival happen off camera, off the news cycle, outside any official conversation. No one asks what he needs. No one takes responsibility for the accumulated damage. Canseco lives in the leftover portion of history, the part that's not told, not archived, not given any meaningful role. Bankruptcy isn't just a number on record, it's the feeling of being stripped of the right to choose. The prolonged lawsuits don't just drain money, they keep him trapped in the past, forcing him to repeat stories that society has decided it no longer wants to hear. Isolation becomes a permanent state. Old friends fade away. former teammates stay silent. The industry that once profited from his strength now keeps a safe distance. In that context, Canseco learns to survive, not to live well, just to get through each day. He takes odd jobs, short-term projects, unstable opportunities. Every step is uncertain, but stopping isn't an option. With no lights, no applause, Canseco faces himself in the rawest state. He understands that when fame shatters, it leaves nothing but unanswered questions. He also understands that healing doesn't come automatically just because time passes. Healing requires structure, support, acknowledgement, things he doesn't have. So he keeps living in a half-state, no longer running from the past, but also not allowed to set it down. The pains remind him every day of the price he paid. The loneliness reminds him that price was never repaid. At times Canseco thought speaking the truth would open a new path. But his post-career proved something else. Society can accept truth as an abstract idea, but it dodges specific responsibility. He didn't become a symbol of reform, he became a forgotten example. And in that forgetting, he has to fend for himself to survive. No medical network, no mental health support system, no transition plan, just long days of self-managing pain and memories. Living in the leftover portion of history means not having the right to rewrite the story in full. It means existing between two states, once everything, now nothing in the eyes of the system. Canseco isn't healed, but he keeps living. Not because of grand hope, but because the survival instinct that followed him from the day his family left Cuba still drives him. He continues, quietly, carrying the bitter lesson that the system can use you to the very end, then pull back when the lights go out. Canseco's post-career has no happy ending. It's a string of survival days where resilience isn't rewarded, only maintained. And in that maintenance, he understands that history isn't written only by victories. It is also written by the people left behind, living on without ever being healed. After all those years surviving in the leftover portion of history, José Canseco faces a punishment longer than any official sentence. He is not forgiven, nor allowed to be forgotten, and certainly not permitted to bury his past decently. There is no Hall of Fame waiting for him at the end of the road, no reconciliation speech, no moment when history turns back to admit the story was more complicated than it was once told. In the official chronicles of American baseball, Canseco's name exists as an irritating footnote, a reminder people would rather avoid than confront. History keeps him in the villain role without examining context, because that role is convenient. It lets the rest stay clean. No Hall of Fame isn't just the absence of a jacket or a ceremony. It's the message that all previous contributions can be completely nullified by a simple moral conclusion. The numbers, the seasons, the moments that changed how the public saw baseball, all placed in quotation marks. When history chooses a tidy narrative, the people who complicate it get pushed out. Canseco understands there is no space for contradiction in collective memory, no room for questions about who benefited, who was harmed, and why an entire era needed those conditions to exist. No reconciliation means no bridge gets built. The words he spoke, whether right or wrong, are not placed in context. They are seen as personal motives, bitterness, sabotage. The silence of others becomes false proof that the story is over. But for Canseco it never ends. He lives in a suspended state, not allowed back in, not allowed to disappear, not loved, but not left alone. Every time history is retold, he reappears as the cautionary example, a convenient template to close off uncomfortable debates. History, when it needs simplicity, chooses a villain. And Canseco is framed in that role because he disrupted the comfort of the storytellers. He didn't just expose personal behavior, he exposed the mechanism. In a culture that prefers myth over truth, keeping him as the villain is the way to protect the beautiful story of the game, and those who run it. So national memory places him outside, not as a flawed human, but as an exception to be isolated. Living outside national memory is living in a void. There you don't get the right to make amends over time, don't get to age normally. Every sign of aging is read as deserved consequence. Every effort to keep living is seen as clinging. Canseco carries that burden through the final years of his ordinary life, not allowed to close the old chapter, not allowed to open a new one. He has no graveyard of memory to bury what has passed. Everything gets dug up whenever an example is needed. The cruelest part, isn't the judgment, it's its permanence. Forgiveness allows a person to move on, forgetting allows history to lighten. But Canseco is denied both. He exists like a hanging exclamation mark, forcing others to remember in the way they choose. In that state, loneliness is no longer an emotion, it's structure. It shapes how he walks, speaks, and looks back at the past. And yet, Canseco still lives, not as an honored icon, but as a human forced to carry an entire era's story on his shoulders without the right to tell it fully. He lives outside national memory, where there is no statue, no bronze plaque, only questions that were never answered fairly. History may never come back to apologize. Collective memory may never expand to hold the complexity. But in that quiet existence, Canseco carries a truth time cannot erase. When a society needs a villain to keep its story tidy, the person chosen as villain will never get to bury their past. They can only keep living on the outside like a cut that was never stitched. After being kept in the villain role of national memory, José Canseco enters a different kind of exhaustion, unlike any physical pain he ever experienced. It is not a desire for death, it does not take the form of explosive despair or suicidal intent. It is the exhaustion of a man who has had to fight his past every single day, a war without gunfire, without an ending whistle, only the endless repetition of labels, distorted stories, and pre-written conclusions. When Canseco says "I want it to end," he is not talking about ending his life, he is talking about ending the loop that drags him back to a simplified version of himself that society has chosen to believe. That exhaustion comes from waking up every morning carrying the same old story. Not the full story, but the convenient condensed version, where every motive is suspected, every word is twisted, and every effort to keep living is seen as justification. Canseco no longer has the energy to argue with every headline, every reminder. He understands there aren't enough words to correct a collective memory that has settled. But that understanding doesn't lighten the load, it only makes the silence longer. He is exhausted from explaining that truth is not a single moment, but a structure. Exhausted from repeating that speaking out does not equal absolution, that warnings are not always received as moral acts. Exhausted from proving he isn't seeking attention when the lights went out long ago. Every time he speaks, he is pulled back into the position of the interrogated, not the heard. And then he learns to stay silent, not out of regret, but because there is no energy left for a one-sided dialogue. I want it to end is the desire to end the distortion, to end every intention being interpreted in the worst possible way, to end every contribution being negated by a single keyword. Canseco doesn't demand forgiveness, he demands the bare minimum fairness of complexity. He doesn't ask history to reverse course, he only wishes history would stop dragging him out as an example whenever a villain is needed. It is the desire to exist without having to justify, to walk down the street as a present human being, not a permanently open file. There are days when he realizes the most exhausting thing isn't the memory itself, but that the memory never ages. Society allows many people to change over time, for him alone it does not. He is kept fixed at one point in one label, as if age doesn't grant the right to peace, and when a person is stripped of the right to peace, living becomes a chain of self-defense days. No one can defend themselves forever without wearing out. Canseco also understands that saying "I want it to end" can be misread. He understands the sensitivity of words in a culture quick to equate any fatigue with extreme intent, but the truth is far simpler. He wants to end having to fight the past, to be allowed to live in the present, to end having every breath carry an explanation, to end having to prove he is not what others need him to be for their story to feel complete. At this level of exhaustion, Canseco's longing becomes heartbreakingly humble. No belated honor, no monument, no public apology, just the right to exist without justification, the right to grow old without being pulled back, the right to be silent without being presumed guilty, the right to say one sentence and have it understood literally, not bent by prejudice. And if there is one thing he still holds on to, it is honesty with his own feelings. He does not hide the exhaustion, nor does he exaggerate it into drama. He calls it exactly what it is: burnout. Burnout from having endured enough. Enough lights, enough labels, enough retellings where he has no right to edit. I want it to end therefore is not a farewell to life. It is the resignation of a man who has fulfilled his part in a story that others continue to write in his place, and in that resignation there is a bare minimum of dignity, the right to exist simply, without having to justify himself. When José Canseco says he wants it to end, it is not the voice of someone completely defeated by history, but the sigh of a man who saw the truth too early, spoke it too directly, and was therefore pushed to the margins when the world was not ready to listen. By this point, much of the American public has grown accustomed to a far simpler story: steroids are an individual sin, and those who use them must bear the consequences. But that story only became easy to tell after the system was forced to change, and that very change unintentionally proves that Canseco was not entirely wrong. The Mitchell Report came into existence not because José Canseco was listened to, but because American baseball had no other choice but to confront a reality that could no longer be hidden. Hundreds of pages of documents, dozens of names, countless pieces of evidence showing that steroids were not an isolated phenomenon, but a structure that existed for years at the heart of MLB, tolerated, ignored, and sometimes even profited from. Yet even when that report confirmed what Canseco had said long before, he was never called a whistleblower. MLB changed its policies, tightened testing, adjusted rules, but never admitted that one man had accepted trading his entire reputation to bring the truth into the light. In the official memory of American baseball, Canseco remains cast as the destroyer, the betrayer, the one who ruined the game. The change happened, but the credit does not go to the person who spoke earliest. That is the most bitter paradox in his legacy. The truth prevailed, but the one who spoke it was discarded. There is no honoring ceremony, no official apology, no historical moment when MLB turns back to José Canseco and says we were wrong to make you the scapegoat. Instead there is prolonged silence, a soft but more cruel denial than any public criticism. History chooses to keep the outcome, but erase its origin, and Canseco, who lived long enough to see the system change, was never allowed to live with the feeling of being acknowledged. His legacy therefore does not exist in museums or halls of fame. It exists in the gaps of history, in the never-ending debates about ethics, responsibility, and collective pretense. Every time MLB refers to the steroid era as a mistake to learn from, José Canseco's name is quickly glossed over, as if mentioning him would make the story too complicated, too uncomfortable. Because to acknowledge Canseco, people would have to acknowledge that American baseball built a golden era on a foundation of deliberate silence. For Canseco, that means living in a strange form of exile. He is not erased from history, but he is also not permitted to stand fully within it. He exists as an irritating reminder, a living proof that truth does not always bring liberation. Some truths only make the one who speaks them bear more loneliness, and it is in that loneliness that Canseco's legacy becomes heavier than any title he ever won on the field. Yet even though he has been removed from official narratives, he cannot be erased. Every serious discussion about steroids in sports leads back to the same point. Someone spoke this out before the system collapsed. Someone accepted becoming the villain to force the truth to be seen, and the price of that choice was not a heroic moment, but an entire life misunderstood. José Canseco's legacy therefore is not the statistics or the home runs that once shook the stands. His legacy is the question that has never been fully answered: can a sport change without acknowledging the people who were crushed to make that change possible? He is proof that the system can evolve while individuals are left behind, carrying all the wounds of that process. At the end of this road, Canseco does not stand as a winner, nor is he entirely a loser. He stands in a much quieter position. The man who spoke the truth saw it confirmed, but was never invited back to history's table. That legacy exists in bitter silence, unnamed, unapplauded, but still present, persistent, uncomfortable, and undeniable. And that very existence, even without honor, is the clearest evidence that José Canseco never disappeared from the story of American baseball, no matter how hard people try to forget him. At the end of that long road full of fragments, José Canseco does not stand in the posture of someone seeking salvation. He does not apologize, because apologizing implies that everything could have been done over in a cleaner way. while his life never allowed that. He does not beg to be understood, because understanding always comes too late, and usually only appears when the price has been fully paid. And he certainly does not hope to be loved, because the public's love has proven to be the most fickle thing of all. What Canseco has left is not a desire to argue, nor a need to justify. He is left only with raw acceptance. He has paid enough for the role history assigned him. Having nothing left to fight for does not mean giving up. It is the state of a man who has understood that any remaining battles are meaningless. Canseco fought poverty from his immigrant childhood, fought family expectations, fought the shadow of his twin, fought a system that demanded limitless strength, fought a betraying body, fought a public that turned its back, fought a collective memory that allowed no complexity. He fought when he was young and when he was old, under lights and in silence. By now he has no further obligation to prove anything, not because he was right in every choice, but because he has borne enough consequences for those choices. In the quiet of his later years, Canseco looks back at his life not with romanticization, but with cold truth. He sees his mistakes clearly, but he also sees clearly the structures that forced him to choose between surviving and disappearing. He does not deny personal responsibility, but he also does not take on the guilt for an entire era. His acceptance is not surrender, it is putting an end to the endless debate over motives and morality, things no longer capable of bringing peace. Canseco understands that history is not a place of absolute justice. History needs tidy stories, clear symbols, convenient villains. He also understands that he was placed in a role he had no right to refuse, but that understanding, instead of making him more bitter, brings a rare form of calm. When you have been stripped of every reward, you are also freed from every expectation. Having nothing left to lose is a belated form of freedom, quiet, unglamorous, but enough to breathe. At this endpoint, Canseco does not try to rewrite history, he simply steps out of it. He accepts that his name will not be engraved on walls of fame, that his contributions will continue to be placed in quotation marks, that complexity will always be reduced, but he also knows one thing: history cannot erase the changes did happen. Rules were tightened, dialogues are no longer avoided, later generations do not have to pay the same price he did. If that is the only legacy left, he accepts it. No credit needed, no applause required. Having nothing left to fight for is also the moment a person allows himself to live in the present, no longer dragged back to the past every day. Canseco no longer defends himself against old labels. He no longer explains motives to those who have decided not to listen. He chooses silence, not as an admission of guilt, but as the bare minimum right of a man who has said enough. In that silence, there is a rare straightforwardness. I did what I did, I paid the price, and I no longer owe anyone another debate. For the American audience, this story is not a call for unconditional forgiveness, nor an attempt to rewrite the past to make it more comfortable. It is a reminder that history is made not only by those who are embraced, but also by those pushed to the margins so the wheel can keep turning. There are people who never stand on the podium of glory, but their absence forces the system to change, and that is the conclusion Canseco leaves, not with an apology, not with a plea, but with the quiet acceptance of a man who has paid enough for his role in a chaotic era. There are those history never embraces, but history changed because of them. Looking back at the entire story of José Canseco, what remains is not anger or judgment, but a heavy and persistent sadness. Sadness because one man went from a harsh immigrant dream where failure was not allowed, to the peak of MLB too fast when his body had not yet matured. Sadness because that very success turned him into a machine measured only by how far he hit, not by pain or human limits. More heartbreaking still, when the system that once profited from his strength turned its back without warning, stripping him of the right to tell his own story, turning him into a stain without a verdict. The story becomes even more painful when it enters his private life. Family disintegrated, not because of death, but because no one could endure a man eroded in both body and mind, the role of father broken not from lack of love, but from prolonged burnout. When Canseco chose to speak the truth through Juiced, he was not seeking belated fame. He believed truth would liberate, but reality was harsher. teammates stayed silent, the system fought back, and he was exiled as a traitor. Even when the Mitchell report forced MLB to change, he was never acknowledged, left to live his post-career years in bankruptcy, physical pain and isolation, living on but never healed. The lesson for the American people lies here: great systems can create legends, but they can also crush people when they see them only as tools. Not everyone who changes history gets embraced by history. So when celebrating success, society needs to learn to look squarely at the human price paid and question collective responsibility. The greatest honor for Canseco is not forgiveness or love, but daring to admit that he paid enough, and because of that, the game was forced to change. If you find José Canseco's story brings you deep reflections on the price of fame and truth, please hit subscribe to join us in the next authentic and deeply human journeys. Thank you for listening to the very end, and see you in the next video, where we continue telling the stories history doesn't always want to mention.